They want to connect with topics like depression, being away from family members. The topics are more social, emotional. But when you look at what the safety directors are assigning, it's all those topics that are tied to CSA scores. So there's a disconnect between what you want to learn and what they're learning. You have to have content that's integrated with, while those topics are essential, they can be incorporated with these other topics that the drivers really want to learn.
Trucking is difficult. It's an essential industry that every corner of the nation depends on, even without knowing it. To the average consumer, the supply chain is magic, and sometimes a black hole. Products on store shelves, dinner on restaurant tables, packages on doorsteps. It's expected to be there on time, every time, and only recognized if there's a service failure. But how is a sausage made? Who's talking about the issues that matter to trucking companies?
Welcome to True North Truck Thought, or the TTT Pod for short, a monthly podcast hosted by Scopelitis Transportation Consulting and brought to you by True North Companies. We're here to demystify the magic, address the black holes, and to talk trucking to the industry we love. Whether it's the latest research, upcoming laws and rules, safety issues and solutions, or practical discussions about real-life supply chain challenges, the TTT Pod is here to help the most important industry in our country to navigate its greatest challenges and opportunities. We bring together some of the best and brightest experts to talk about and tackle some of the most pressing industry issues. So without further ado, I'm Steve Keppler.
And I'm Sean Garney. Let's get trucking. Without our drivers, this industry stops. The job of what I'll call driver support staff, dispatchers, safety managers, and the like, is to provide our drivers with the tools they need to perform at the top of their game. After all, our success depends on their performance. Over the years, motor carriers have come to rely on driver coaching and training programs to help provide the knowledge drivers need to succeed. Unfortunately, in some cases, these training programs become routine activities that lack stickiness and therefore are less effective. Today's podcast will focus on how we can make driver training more effective, but not by changing the frequency or debating the values of event-based training versus scheduled knowledge transfer, or even remote versus in-person delivery. Today, we're going to talk about building effective training programs by understanding how adults learn. How do adults process information? And what makes a training module sticky? What learning models can we deploy that will give us confidence that our drivers will access the critical tools we seek to provide in that moment of need? Here to unpack these issues today are two special guests, one new and one familiar. First is our old friend Bert Mayo. Bert is Vice President of Risk Solutions at True North Companies. With more than 20 years of experience in the transportation industry, Bert has developed a reputation for partnering with his clients to develop and implement corporate-wide strategies focused on preventing injuries and crashes. Next is Dr. Gina Anderson, co-founder and CEO of Luma Brighter Learning, a learning management system that delivers educational content to drivers nationwide. Gina has more than 25 years of experience in education and leadership, and since 2014 has focused on studying professional driver learning behaviors to improve strategies for engagement. She routinely publishes new, measurable, science-based techniques specifically focused on driver learning to help companies improve their safety scores and remain compliant. She holds a Doctor of Education in Instructional Learning Systems from Indiana University and is author of Teaching Without a Teaching Degree, Luma Learning Lessons. Bert and Gina, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much.
Well, I'm excited about today's topic, and I'm excited to address it in what I think will be a slightly different way. We talk a lot about training, and so often when we talk about training, it's about when do we deliver training and how do we deliver training, not what makes our training effective. There are lots of companies out there that just train because they know it's the right thing to do, but they haven't spent a lot of time learning how to train. And so that's why I'm super excited that Gina's here with us today, because we're going to really unpack how adults learn and how to best get to that. So, without further ado, I think we can hop right into it, and we'll just kick it over to Gina really, really quickly, and just, to point out that you're an expert in adult learning and maybe not necessarily trucking. So tell us a little bit about your background and how somebody who's whose passion is learning and teaching comes to the trucking industry?
Yeah, certainly. So my interest really started when I taught special education, and I noticed there were unique needs that some learners had. And why were they challenged in learning certain things? And so I was interested in studying methodologies in the brain and really looking at why some learners didn't assimilate and remember content and others thrived. And when you really look at the unique ways that our brain processes information and how we present information, we have a real opportunity to reach learners at all varying levels of ability. And so children become, middle schoolers who then become adults, and the learning challenges are the same. So you may have a distinct learner with a learning challenge or not, but we still have to look at the brain and how we process information to uniquely position ourselves so that a truck driver who gets in a semi truck or any kind of vehicle, even us as drivers, can access information later and recall it so that we are safe.
So that's interesting, Gina. I think, so when you're looking at kind of driver training, compared with kind of more traditional learning environments, particularly with adults, obviously it's a different, they're a different workforce, right? So, in your experience working with, a number of large fleets and drivers, what do you see as some of the biggest challenges trying to train such a diverse and kind of remote workforce with truck drivers?
Yeah, I would say looking at the human psychology of really how you process information and behave to be able to change behaviors. And I think this delivery of one approach fits all or one content medium fits all just isn't going to work for safety for all drivers. And the reality is it's grounded in learning science. We could look at examples of how your brain processes information. When you think about all of us driving down the road, we've all been in a situation where you end up somewhere and you're like, how did I even get here? Right? We've all been in that situation. And the reality is, even though you want to focus, the brain processes information as such where it may not be engaged to focus. And so what we really look at strategies so that doesn't happen. So you don't become complacent when you're in a semi. And even though you are your intention isn't to cause an accident, you do. So the way that your brain processes information, and when you study people with learning challenges, is you see this even more. Your brain activates something as your neurons within your cognitive ability. You activate these neurons to recall information. And so when you do a behavior over and over and over and over and over again, it creates this distinct connection between neurons where you're able to recall information from your short-term memory into your long-term memory and then recall it. Think of brushing your teeth. Do any of you think about when you brush your teeth? You just do it, right? You brush your teeth. Think about walking. When you learn to walk, you just walk. You don't even think about it. That's because your neurons have made that distinction to be able to process it and retain a skill. Well, when you're driving, when you become a driver and you've done something for 30, 40 years, or even 15 years, you've done it time and time and time again. Now it's in your long-term memory. You know how to do it. But what happens is, as you do things time and time and time and time and time again, your neurons start to become less and less. And so from a cognitive processing standpoint, you have to activate those neurons in those situations to be able to process it and be attended to while you're driving a vehicle. And so the idea is to provide strategies of not only how to reach the human behavior to be able to make change, but also strategies of how to activate your mind during those situations so that you don't get in a situation where you do kill someone and you're like, I don't even know how that happened.
It sounds like what you're saying, Gina, is that, and Bert's saying drivers know what to do just generally. And of course, we're talking about experienced drivers here. So there's another conversation a little bit later. But it sounds like one of the things you're saying, Gina, is that we've got to keep those neurons active so that they can make those decisions as they go. But I'm guessing that there's more to it than just repetition, right? So
Exactly.
what makes it really effective in that way? I mean, we can keep saying, don't look at your phone, don't look at your phone, don't look at your phone.
Right.
It is Distracted Driver Month, so that was an appropriate reference. So I'm
Yes.
going to pat myself on the back. Um, but how do we get that? How do we get that those neurons to fire in that moment of need? Right.
Exactly. So I love that. So first of all, the first step of learning is getting somebody's attention, and you're not going to get everybody's attention the same way. You uniquely have to present information in different modes and different ways to get their attention. The other thing too is hooking into the essence of human psychology. So there's different levels of engagement that reach people at different ways. So if we talked each of us of what motivates us to learn, there's going to be a different factor to that. And so, do you reach somebody at the human survival level? Are you learning this skill because it could mean life or death at the very bottom of that authenticity scale? Really, why are you doing this? Maybe there's a personal example that happened to you, or maybe someone that you know has had an experience that really connects to you. And then the second piece of that is the why. Why should I do it? So you shouldn't pick up your phone, but really giving a strategy of how not to pick up your phone. So put it away, put it in a box, put it out of reach. But the safety reason why is essential. And that's really the second level of the human psychology of changing behavior. Because you're number one, somebody might be afraid to break the rule. They might be afraid of killing someone. I mean, I hope somebody would. They don't want to, but you still see people on their phone doing it. So, there's different levels of reaching people, and that really comes down to the authenticity, Sean, of the curriculum.
So that I think that's a really good point. Even my own family, all talking, everybody learns differently, right? So and so much of the training content that's kind of written today and delivered today is really not is done so really in many cases not acknowledging that fact that people learn differently, right? And so kind of that personal kind of engagement. So maybe talk a little bit about what are the primary ways that drivers learn and kind of how can we assess our training methods to accommodate those different methodologies?
Yeah, so we've been studying drivers specifically in terms of the type of content that they want to engage in for the almost 7 years now. And in fact, the drivers tell us, and we can kind of study that they really like to engage in content that's relevant to them. So instead of sending out something generic, it makes sense if they're driving a Biltmore or a specific truck or a specific entity, they want to learn about what's applicable to them and their organization. And in addition, they're so busy. They're in the truck and they don't need to sit through 45, 2 hours, 3 hours of that training. One, because their attention is such that it's not going to be able to keep their attention. But two, cognitively, their brain, even if they are the most engaged person in the world, it's going to drop that information. So they're not even going to remember it. So it's not only the type of way you present it and what, it's kind of the length of that information too. And it really ties back to when they're in that situation, you want them to be able to recall it. So the drivers want to connect with you. What we're finding is when we just did our 2023 research with the drivers are saying they want to connect with topics like depression, being away from family members. The topics are more social emotional, but when you look at what the safety directors are assigning, it's all those topics that are tied to CSA scores. So there's a disconnect between what you want to learn and what they're learning. You have to have content that's integrated with, while those topics are essential, they can be incorporated with these other topics that the drivers really want to learn.
And that's a really interesting point because we just talked about a minute ago distractions in the cell phone, but a lot of those distractions also are social related, right? They're thinking about, oh, I've got to make it home to take my kids to their soccer practice, or they had an argument with someone. So that's a really relevant point, and people don't think about that.
Yeah, exactly. It has to be relevant. And there's a disconnect between what they're assigned and how they're assigned it and how drivers learn and what they want to learn. And so we really have to take the data and look at that information so that you can deliver content in just in time, what they need when they need it.
So, yeah, that's fantastic. Just one point and then a question. We're talking about drivers, right? And sometimes some folks in the trucking industry do a bad job of humanizing drivers, right? And we're speaking about specifically driver learning techniques, right? But I think, and Jeannie, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but as I read the stuff that you've put out, I think all of this stuff applies to me too, right? They just all apply to adults. And so is one effective strategy when thinking about training to think about what would be interesting to me, or how could I make something sticky or effective for me as an adult learner? Those are the same, right?
So I would say that people tend to teach the way that they learn. And so if you're reflecting on how you want drivers to learn based on how you learn, there's going to be a disconnect because you're going to primarily teach, and you go to conferences and different presentations, and they're very instructor led. I mean, in terms of the delivery of the content, because that's how you've learned. And so there's a lot of research that shows that it's very difficult as an instructor to take different methodologies when you're not comfortable teaching in that methodology to help drivers learn. Drivers tend, it's interesting, Sean, we did a study a few years ago about driver to driver learning methods. It's not done in trucking. Drivers aren't typically, not in all cases, asked to share knowledge about what they know to mentor other drivers. Drivers really appreciated that from a retention standpoint, but that's a different methodology. Letting drivers teach each other about their expertise in the industry is a whole different way of teaching. But what happens is safety directors often get nervous. Well, they're going to say something wrong, or they're going to say misinformation, but that's your job as a coach. You coach them in that situation to be able to empower them to be educators themselves. So, does that safety director necessarily, is that how they learn? Maybe not. Maybe they learn best by having somebody tell them or show them. So giving multiple opportunities for that experience is essential, because what's going to happen if you don't offer different modalities of instruction, there's going to be learners lost in that translation.
Yeah, I love that. I recall a presentation that you gave on the different learning methods, and I remember thinking to myself, I am a peer-to-peer learner in a lot of ways, and that we've lost that in the trucking industry. I'm wondering if you could just talk a little bit about the other types of learning, right? We have instructor to learner, learner to content, learner to learner, and just a little bit more on that case study that you did, because I remember hearing about that and thinking, I just mentioned earlier that sometimes we have a tendency to to be a little paternalistic with our drivers, right? But giving them the freedom to help teach each other, because they are professionals, is great. So I'd love to learn a little bit more about the different types of learning, and then maybe a little deeper on the peer-to-peer learning case study you did.
Yeah, so there's this whole myth in learning that there's this thing called there's more of a learning preference than a learning style. So this was dispelled decades ago, but you still hear this conversation about learning styles. It's really about a preference to learn. So how do you prefer to learn? And so you think about, we're very a mobile society now. There's a lot of content that you learn on your own. And so it's really a learner to self. So you have drivers coming to a situation that they're learning all day on their phone. They've already have all this information. It's learner to self. And so when they come to that situation, how do you take a learner to self? Is you engage them in a conversation with other learners. So they come with prior knowledge, and you have them engage with other learners. And then the instructor becomes, instead of standing at the front talking at you, because they're already disengaged because of attention spans, and you have them get into the conversation with the learners. We had learners engaging, and you can do this in person, you can do this asynchronous online. anytime, anywhere. I mean, there's different, even you can look at the different modes or these different interaction types, and then you can take it a step further into kind of how you're doing it, whether it's face to face, whether it's in person, whether it's online or asynchronous, and that's a whole different level. But the learner to learner engagement is quite interesting from the driver's perspectives. So you have learner to self, learner to learner, learner to instructor. Now, this doesn't mean that you have a sage on the stage giving information. This means kind of like what Bert talked about is coaching. You have a coaching situation that you can do in person, you can do online, you can do one-on-one, you can do in pods. Learner to instructor doesn't mean a sage on the stage disseminating information. It means kind of a collaborative learning effort. And sometimes you do need somebody that has more experience showing you or walking you through that procedure. There's also a fairly new stage called learner to machine. Have you all seen that before? Yeah. So learning to machine is you don't even need to have, and this is happening right now in the vehicles. You're driving, and all of a sudden this activates a neuron, and all of us have experienced this, right? You're in your car, and if you have a newer vehicle, it says you need a coffee break, or put your hands on the wheel, or it's giving you information. It's having automated processes for learning. It happens a lot in marketing, out in grocery stores. It's like you're learning through this process or methodology that doesn't even involve a person or a human. And it's happening. And there's a lot of opportunity with AI and different, and where we see it, there's so much in the news about it, that learning has happened. There's not going to be a control of an instructor disseminating. It's already, I mean, this is already passed.
So that's an interesting thought, because I think traditionally, right, when we think about training, we think about, to your point, kind of, there's an instructor, there's a class, there's a test, there's an assessment. Did they acquire that knowledge? So in this new model that you're talking about, how, if I'm a safety director or someone in management, what are some ways that I can assess in this kind of bifurcated different model? How can I assess whether or not any training or knowledge, how my drivers are accepting and know this stuff?
So, Steve, it's really changing behaviors. I mean, that's really what we're looking at. We're looking at how they can apply this information. Yeah, you can recall information, and there's a way of doing that with learner to content, which is another way of presenting information. But ultimately, it's changing behaviors and how you see safety incidents decreasing. And what we're seeing, like, for example, last year we did a study with Dart Transit Company and saw their safety scores improving. Their safety scores are improving because they're utilizing these different communication and learning strategies, not just video content to learner. They're utilizing a whole package to increase their safety. They're doing coaching, they're doing ongoing communication. So it's this idea of seeing improvements in safety, because that's ultimately the goal in this industry. It's coming home safe. Yeah, I think definitely what you're talking about is that peer-to-peer kind of model where you're having others teach each other. I think the important piece of that is making sure that the content is consistent and the message is consistent. So having a system that you can put that curriculum so that it can be used for that consistency is important, because otherwise you'll be in a situation where everyone's doing their own thing, teaching their own way. They don't, one person's doing it this way and saying this, and this person's doing that. So I think it's a very strategic method that you put in place so that it's a train the trainer program that is anchored at a higher level, if that makes sense. Because then everybody is supporting. Yep. Mm-hmm.
I'd like to, there seems to be some dissonance here though, right? Because we're talking about training based on the method of learning most appropriate for particular drivers. But then we're also talking about sort of consistency. So how do we respond? Do we need to customize our training for individual drivers, or should it be customized across? Like, how do we create a training platform that is consistent but reaches all learner types?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So it's creating different opportunities for different learners. For example, we have companies who will do content to learner through orientation online. So they're able to go in and learn at their own pace, learn the information, be able to go back and refer to the information, rather than coming to a classroom, having that disseminated from an instructor for 4 hours. So giving that information, the important stuff, a little bit, and kind of timing how much content is given. If they are coming in person, utilizing that time to reinforce important concepts so that person who does need that auditory example is getting the most essential content that they need. So it's providing those opportunities. We have some clients that offer opportunities for face to face, but also offer online opportunities to be able to diversify that information. And again, if you think about it, for those neurons and repetition that we talked about, you have to get the information on the average learner with no prior knowledge between 7 and 9 times before that will even begin to go into your long-term memory. And so the idea is, even if they see it once and hear it once, they have to hear it again anyway. So why not give it to them in a different methodology and different way, so that they are able to commit it to their long-term memory?
So in this new model that you're talking about, traditionally, there's a job in a motor carrier, whether there's safety director or someone else, but they're the instructor, right? Their job is to train. So in this new model where you've got kind of this diversified strategy and approach, we talk a lot about training the drivers, but how do we equip the instructors to kind of operate in this new environment? And what type of qualities should we be looking for as a motor carrier to identify potential people in our companies that can help support this new model?
Yeah, I would say definitely the person has to be open to change and thinking about how they currently teach. So it's a flexibility of having done something for a long time and seeing that there could be other ways of doing it. They don't have to have a teaching degree. And to Bert's point, that's really why I put the book together. You think about 2020, everyone that was doing online learning. And in fact, this is kind of a side note, a lot of the emergency research that was done during that period, was really focused on people without the skills to do it. All these people are put in the skill set to do it. So giving them tools, giving them a resource to help them and support them through that, and giving them the technology, because there is technology out there, like Luma, that is able to support people who are open to these different methodologies. But if somebody this is how people learn, this is how I've done it, this is the way it's done, and we're going to continue to do it just to check a box, then they're not the right person to do it. Just because it does take a different situated mindset to think about wanting support to deliver content in a different way.
I love the reference to the pandemic, because I think we can spot a trend here where before the pandemic, and Bert and Steve confirm or deny this, there was a lot more sort of in-person learning, right? We'd have our safety meetings at our terminals, our monthly meetings or whatever they were, where we'd sort of be in person. And then a lot of folks just moved to virtual because it was a necessity. It was something that had to happen. But a lot of folks have found a great efficiency in that. Mm-hmm. And so have we learned as an industry how to retain that sort of effectiveness or that stickiness, just virtually, just by assigning trainings? Or is there follow-up that we should think about? Or do we need to begin including other things like gamification or other sort of, what are the other virtual tools that we can use, or remote tools, I should say, that we can use to really drive this learning, this stickiness?
Yeah, I would say from my perspective, there is a lot of opportunity. And I will say that just because it was online doesn't mean it was done well or based in best practices. I mean, I think we were forced to go online, and there's a lot of research that says, oh, online is bad. And there is bad online learning. But like to your point, there are opportunities to engage learners through game-based learning or through incentives. But there's also an opportunity to say, okay, what are the best of both worlds? Because the research has shown for decades that there is a lot of benefit to blended learning. So there is good opportunity to be in person and to make those connections. Retention in this industry is, so critical. So to do that, there is something about being in person with that individual and building those connections and having that consistency in a platform that you can refer back to, so that you have that information for them and also after. But I think to your point, there isn't one way, I mean, to do this. And so to be able to capitalize on the blended learning model is really, really, really integral at this point, because now you have. So where can you save the most resources and time? By doing some things online and doing some things perhaps in person when they come and pick up the truck.
But it's a really interesting point. I think, to me, key is flexibility and understanding your audience, right? For sure. You mentioned a few minutes ago about the book you wrote. Maybe talk to us a little bit about that. Kind of what are because you talk about building learning communities and trucking. Maybe talk a little bit about that. And if I'm a carrier, kind of, okay, this is great stuff. What do I do? How do I start? Where do I go from here?
Yeah, so it can seem really overwhelming because there are a lot of different ways, and a lot of different modes. So the first thing that I would always recommend is think about your objectives and think about the goals and what you want to accomplish. Once you look at your goals and you look at your objectives, specifically, how are you going to measure that this was a success? Because that's important. Because if you're going to put time and resources against changing the way you do something, you always have to have your objective specifically in a measurable way. So you can say, yeah, this was a success or this wasn't a success. So, I mean, starting out, definitely having your goals and objectives. Then looking at that and saying, okay, what out of the content that I currently do can be delivered in a certain format? So you look at the format in terms of what I mean by that. Is it done online? Is it done face to face? Is there some combination there within? I did a whole year of different blogs on doing blended instruction, and so that means you do some face to face, you do a portion face to face, and you do a portion online. And so looking at that and thinking about what would save you the most time. You don't need to come in person and sign 1,000 forms and spend an hour. You don't need to do that anymore. You can review them with them, answer questions online through asynchronous technology if that makes sense. And we have carriers doing that, but kind of looking what's going to save you time and money to be able to reach those objectives. And then you can drill down and look at the format. What is the outline of the content? So really outlining what the content is for those different sessions. And then you can take it a step further and think about, what does that content look like? What medium is the best of that content? And so when we work with clients at Luma, we look at that pathway of developing a whole program, a safety program. And really what you're doing is you're building a safety culture, because that's really the ultimate goal, is to really help you communicate and build a safety culture. And through that, you go through an instructional design process to be able to utilize the best of all of the tools for your objectives. Because I can tell you, we could talk to 100 carriers. Some of them are similar, but some of them have very different objectives of what they're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, and hopefully all of their objectives revolve around building safety cultures. Mm-hmm. And I think, Steve and I certainly talk about your training program as an important element of your safety culture. We work with some fleets that are just, consistently over the road. They have a sort of a disaggregated model, and have a hard time getting people together. In fleets like that, in which most of our interactions are going to be remote in some way, it's going to be a phone call or a text message or a assigned learning module. How are we going to use our training tech to build a safety culture? One, and two, can we measure our success in that way?
Yeah, so the first thing I would say is definitely, yes, you can utilize online tools to help build a safety culture. It doesn't have to be online, because it's about the communication and messaging that you're reiterating and the why it's important to your organization. So the first thing is you can communicate through tools, like you said, a video message, set up the context of the why. You can do video messaging, in technology, and have you as the safety director, or have one of the drivers, bring in your drivers, have them say the why this is important. And what is this for your organization? We have one carrier whose president every week is sending out, and they have drivers sending out video messages on the why, kind of the next week bringing in an example of the why. We have another carrier who's doing safety meetings, safety meetings in Luma Live, to reiterate these safety messages. So you send out a safety message, they get it on their computer or their phone or their tablet, in their cabs, while they're not driving. And then they attend a safety meeting. So you're coming together at the same time to connect like we are today. You can have live conversations to discuss the safety messages, and then following up to be able to get that content again in a nugget, in a little short bit of content to reinforce those concepts, and then to give an assessment. So how do you know? You say, how do you measure it? So you can measure who's getting the messages, how much time are they spending on there. You can get time as a measure of engagement. How often are they going back to it? Are they opening it and going back, or are they not? Are they coming to the live sessions? We have the ability to track if they're there and if they come back. So did they come? How much time are they in the meeting? If you have 100 people, you can get a report to see when they're coming and when they're going and how long they were there. And then secondarily, if you're following up with content and assessments of the most essential concepts that you're trying to get forth in that webinar, you can then assess their understanding by sending out assessment on that. Ultimately, are they able to recall that information when they need it? We had a driver once out on the road. His truck was on fire, and a carrier told us that the carrier called and said he was able to put out the fire because he recalled the image of the fire extinguisher that was in the e-nugget while he was out at the scene. And he told the police officer, he's like, how did you know how to do that? And he's like, oh, I remembered the e-nugget. And that's not by chance. And it's not because he did it one time, because they had this culture of safety and fires and putting out fires and the messaging. And then it just so happened that he was able to recall the image, because that's based on science, at the scene of the accident. And so it's all of these methods coming together. Were they able to do it? Because ultimately that's what we want. We want the driver to come back alive.
Well, so that's interesting, as I think traditionally when we deliver training, there's a test or a quiz or an exam afterwards, right? And so I think what you're talking about is, in your experience, certainly that is something to use as a way to assess knowledge transfer. But not everyone's good test takers, right? They're different types of learners. So to me, I think what I'm hearing you say is you have to have a kind of a comprehensive strategy, because it's not just about how well they did on the quiz, but did they perform as you expected them to when they needed to, right? And so I think as carriers contemplate, well, what's my model going forward? They need some of that knowledge, acceptance, and behavior. You're not going to know right away, right? It's going to take time to see that over a period of time. And I think that's a culture shift, right, within carriers to say, okay, we're committed to this. We're moving from our model, and here's why, right? Is that what I'm hearing you say, kind of that type of approach? Or
Yeah, I think it's a combination, Steve. Definitely having assessments is one way of reinforcing the information. I would say is the way I think about it. You're reinforcing the concepts because again, you have to see and hear things multiple times to commit it to your long-term memory. So that's just one reinforcement. That doesn't mean they know. That doesn't mean they know that information. What means they know is when they are on the road and they can perform that information. So today you have the ability to use videos from the cabs to see how they're performing in the cabs. And some trucks have those, some carriers don't use those, but you can actually see their behaviors and then coach them on those behaviors and utilize them not in a negative way, but in a positive way to help the drivers be safe. Because ultimately that's what we want. We want to improve and change their behaviors. And so these strategies really can help.
Yeah, I really like that. I know we're coming up on time. I want to just tact very quickly to sort of new learners, or not new learners, but people learning new information for the first time, because talking a lot about repetition. You mentioned that, we just brush our teeth because we've done it so many times, and it's in our brain to be repetitive. Of course, every time I brush my teeth, I think to myself, why can't I get my kids to consistently brush their teeth? I've got orange on my hands because yesterday I was painting my daughter's bike orange for my son because it's going to be his. And in the process, we took the bike apart. We talked about the parts. And I'm certain if I sent him out to rebuild that bike tomorrow, he would not know how to do it. So my wife talks about the knowledge tree. She says it's easier to learn once you've already sort of created a tree on which you can hang new pieces of information.
Yes. Your wife is very talented. Yes.
Yeah. So then when we have newer drivers, maybe drivers just came out of school, how are we going to help them build that tree? And one of your papers talked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I'm not sure if that sort of plays into this, but we need new drivers, and we need new drivers to be great on day one. So how do we work on training drivers who maybe don't have that base of knowledge?
Yeah, so Maslow's hierarchy of needs is about changing behavior. So that actually applies to people who know the content but aren't performing the content. So like putting your phone away. So that would be an example of somebody you know not to do it. So how are we going to change their behavior? So that's a strategy. For somebody that's brand new, really what you're talking about is the scaffolds haven't formed and the neuron connections haven't formed yet. So just like a new tennis player, when you think about going out and hitting a tennis ball, it's that repetitive nature of hitting it. Stop and hit, stop and hit, stop and hit, drop and hit. It's over and over.
Gina used to be a collegiate tennis star. I think that's where the reference comes from. Is that right?
Yeah. So I did play tennis in college. Yep. So, but anyway, yes. So the repetition of that, same with content knowledge. Now, some things are going to be harder for you to form that connection with, like that. Even if some of us at trigonometry, we could sit and try to learn it and look at it in different ways, but you just can't make that connection. And that's because of the way sometimes our brains are wired. And so it's trying to help somebody who can't perform a skill to be able to do it and break it down. And so what you do is you create task analysis of breaking down the steps into simpler parts so that you can start to learn the individual parts in a repetitious way so you can start bringing them together. So, I've taught someone once how to tie their shoe that couldn't tie their shoe. That's a very complex task if you think about it, tying your shoe. So
that's what my kids would say for sure.
Yeah. So how do you break that down? It's same with new driver. You're putting them in a semi truck. That's all I really, if I put me in a semi truck, it's going to take me a long time, even, to break all those tasks down into a task analysis to be able to do that. And then to be able to repeat those in a way. So you're going to go take someone out in a truck and explain it. And then you're going to expect them to go in that. I observed orientations. It's horrific. It's like you take someone out to a truck, you say, okay, this is this, and all right, here are your keys. And it's like, this person's never driven it. What do you think? They're going to go back it. Come on. So, it's really about breaking the tasks up, smaller pieces of information over multiple periods of time, over a long period of time to be able to reinforce those concepts. So you don't train a new driver the same way you're going to train. Think about kids. You have to train them differently than you would somebody that's experienced, that has prior knowledge. But we put everybody in the room and we train them the same way. That's what's done in trucking. It's definitely, Sean, it's definitely not right. We really have to look at different methodologies. If you want to bring everybody in,
but it's hard. That's why I asked it. Operationally, that's hard. If I'm managing a lot of drivers and I know I've got this group that are sort of new C drivers, this group that are A drivers, like what's easy for me is to just train them all in one way. So are there easy tips to figure that out, or what do we do practically?
Yeah, I think it's offering different formats so that you do have different opportunities for those drivers to learn. The problem is we're bringing them all in together and that's it.
Yeah.
That's really it. We're checking the box.
You're checking the box. Yep.
And you're checking a box, and you don't want to put the time and effort in because you don't have it. You're depleted. I get it. It's like you're depleted, but you know what? If you don't put the time and effort in, that drivers might not come home, or someone else's family might not come home.
That's right. Well, it's interesting because we're talking to a very large fleet this couple months back, but they, and I'm sure they're not the only one, but they did an analysis, and the drivers that were on the first 90 days of employment are the most critical from a safety perspective, right? And from a retention perspective. And so, and this is to your point, to me, it's not just about, you got to have a bifurcated approach depending on where they are in their journey, right? Of knowledge and safety, and making sure you're constantly, and you just don't set it and forget it, right? So you've got to constantly evolve your training to meet your needs. And I think you said something earlier, it's absolutely critical, is make sure you got clear goals and objectives and ways you're going to measure, right?
Exactly. You can't send a 45-minute video out to your fleet and expect them to retain the information. Period. It's not that video's bad. There's a way to do it, but it's the way that this industry has been doing it for decades.
Yeah, I love that. I have really appreciated this conversation today. I know we're coming up on time. Before we close, though, and in the spirit of this conversation, I think we should recap. It's time to be a little repetitive on our key takeaways, our key learning techniques or key bits of knowledge. So if you had one or two suggestions to give to a carrier who's finding their training program less effective than what they want to be, what would you tell them?
I would say, first of all, start small. I mean, this is not a sprint. It's a marathon. You're changing your learning program.
Is also a marathon runner, so now we have both tennis and marathon running together. So this is working out perfect.
That's all. I use the sports analogies. I would use March Madness, but we're coming down to the end of that too. So anyway, so I would say start small. The second thing I would say is think about the authenticity to your learners. If you're doing something generic, it's number one, not going to get their attention, and they're certainly not going to remember it. So think about how you're going to connect with learners using psychology, human psychology, and that's something we can think through, but to connect with them and build that authenticity. The third thing I would say as a final recommendation is think about the modes and mediums that you're using currently to reach your learners. If everybody is learning in the same mode, in the same way, in the same medium, I would recommend you think about changing that. And again, it's starting small and then expanding out. But those are three really good takeaways I would recommend.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Gina, for your time today. Couldn't be more appreciative of the contributions that you've made to training in trucking. I think ultimately, as I said in the intro, we need to rely on our drivers to keep our industry safe. And so providing them the tools that they need to succeed is absolutely imperative. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to offer Steve his opportunity for parting shots. And until next time.
Thank you, Gina. You're fantastic. You're a great guest, and I think are really helping change the dynamics and the kind of the evolution of the industry over time. And I think Sean and I coming into this year, one of our key objectives was let's focus more on the drivers and be driver centric. They're not a commodity, right? We need to support them because they're helping all of us be better. So thank you for all you're doing to help the industry. So
thank you both. I appreciate you both too. I know you're doing a lot, and like you said, and I think we're all in this together. Together we can do great things, and I appreciate the partnership and what we're all doing. So thank
One
you.
shining moment. There's our NCAA reference.
All right.
All right, y'all. Right. You take care. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, let me take us out here, Sean and Gina. So thanks for listening to this episode of True North Truck Thought. If you enjoyed the topic today and want to tune in for future conversations here on the TTT Pod, make sure to follow us. Also, please don't hesitate to let us know which topics you want us to cover in future episodes. Drop us a line in the comment section or send us an email to transportationnews@truenorthcompanies.com. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.